The Aspen Institute is a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization that basically convenes stakeholders on particular issues. My issue is communications policy. One of our projects was a task force on learning and the internet, where we looked at, well, what do we need in terms of the internet and to foster the use of online technology for learning, and at the same time create an atmosphere that people are willing to use the online environment. So at your seats, we have reports called Learner at the Center of a Network World. We had a distinguished group of 20 people. The honorary co-chair was Jeb Bush, and the other honorary co-chair was the actress Rosario Dawson, who's also chairman of Voto Latino. And the co-chair was John Bailey, who's now competing with us in another session. So John was terrific, and we just have a great admiration and gratitude to the Foundation for Excellence in Education. The vision was essentially not look at education, but look at the learner. And if you put the learner, really put the learner at the center, you see so many different places where one learns, not just in school, but after school, at home, online, on television, museums, libraries. And so that was our vision. What were the implications? And we ended up with 5 pillars, essentially putting the learner at the center. We need equity of access. We needed interoperability. We needed digital age literacies. And finally, but not least, but very much to the center, was you needed a trusted environment where people wanted to go and were willing to go or send their children to learn. So that was an essential element, create trusted environments for learning. And of course, in this area, this is no different from what's going on all over the world. There's great concern and attention to what's going on with privacy and security and safety online. And we see it as a tension of values. That's sort of a very Aspen Institute thing, which is to look at the tension of values. And a lot of times it's community versus liberty, or equality versus efficiency, or one thing or another. Well, this I see as essentially, we're seeing it in the national security area, the national security versus civil liberties. That's very strong in our country right now. Public benefit versus personal control. I think of the Ebola, the nurse who said, how can you keep me in confinement? When the people around her are saying, yeah, that's an imposition to you, but we don't feel real safe. So that's a constant tension. And of course, efficiency and individuality versus privacy and security in the educational field. So looking at this, and we have different ways of looking at what are the questions of security, privacy, and safety, ultimately to the benefit of the learner. That's what it's all about. And so as part of our recommendations, we had a series of recommendations, but one of the key ones was to create a trusted environment, and I'll get back to that in a second. And we had several principles, and actually Brendon Lynch is going to speak on that part of the report in a little bit, in a few minutes. But ultimately, what we wanted to do was change the discussion from an environment of fear to an environment of trust, and a culture of trust. So just that is the background where I come into it, but also I think a good way of understanding the panel that we're about to hear. So without further ado, let me introduce the panelists, and I'm going to step down here so I can give Aimee Guidera the slide clicker. And Aimee is the founder and executive director of the Data Quality Campaign, which is a nonprofit, nonpartisan national advocacy organization looking to empower all the stakeholders in the educational system, particularly parents, students, and teachers, to achieve greatness in learning and promote effective data use to ensure students graduate from high school and are prepared for success in college and the workplace. So, Aimee, give us, why is this data even important? Why don't we just sort of not collect data, not worry about data, and just make sure everybody's safe and keeps their privacy?
Great question. Thank you, Charlie. Thanks for the intro, and thanks so much for all of you being here at the end of a conference and sticking around to talk about what used to be the least sexy of any topic at a conference, which was data. And somehow in the last year, it's gotten a little bit more interesting and the crowds have filled up. So thank you for being part of that crowd. Partly, we never at the DQC talk about data privacy without first answering Charlie's question. Why are we collecting this? Because partly what happens is if you only talk about the fear and you don't talk about the why, and all you ever hear about is all the scary things, the answer is just shut everything down. And so what's really important in this conversation, and I'm really, really, really bad at telling jokes, so I'm going to tell you my punchline of my couple of remarks up now, and then reinforce it over and over again, and this is the punchline for you too, is that we've got to start the conversation with what's the goal here? Why are we collecting this? What's in it for me as a mom? What's in it for me as a taxpayer? What's in it for me as a citizen? And reminding ourselves, why are we doing this? Why are we having this conversation about privacy and security and protecting this data? The reason why is we're actually starting to use data in education, which is truly a transformational moment in education. Here what you have, and we have all kinds of materials in the back, sorry as I hit the senator with paper, is really a picture of what does it look like when a teacher's using data well throughout the school year? How does it change what's going on? How does it change the conversations that teacher's having with her students, with the parents, with her peers, with her boss? And what changes as a result of having this information? And we think we have to do a better job of clarifying this conversation as we continue to talk about safeguarding data. Because if people don't understand that this data is all about answering their questions, then people don't understand why we're actually doing it. And so what we continue to need to do, I think, as a society, and especially in this sector, is reminding people this is about meeting the questions that you have as a mom, as a teacher, as a student, as a governor, as a legislator. What is it that you need to know? And the great story right now is we have the data in place to answer almost every question that you could possibly ask. That's a powerful moment that we need to embrace. And what we go and look and see is just this incredible evolution, to Charlie's point about we're really changing this. And what the Aspen report is all about is changing this culture around the use of data where we're not using it in education anymore for compliance box checking purposes. That's what we used to do. Quality of the data wasn't very good. People used it because they had to check boxes to get the money to come to them. And everybody knew no one's going to use it, so it doesn't really matter how great it is. I'd firmly say that we're definitely in the era of using data for accountability. And as someone who cares very, very deeply about accountability and all the conversations we've had here the last day, accountability matters. But what's also happened around data and accountability is that for lots of people, especially our educators, our teachers, see that data for accountability as being used as a hammer, not as a flashlight. And as a result, we have a lot of teachers who are legitimately scared about using data because they fear that it's not going to help them, but it's going to be used to hurt them. That's a conversation we absolutely need to change if we're truly going to leverage the power of data, which is all about using it for continuous improvement, about personalization of learning, about tapping into and leveraging all this great information to truly meet the needs and to transform education. So if we really start with that conversation about that and we get people excited about using it, we also need to realize that the more that we're talking about it and using this data and the more access we have to this information and people are hearing about it, the more that we're also hearing about the concerns. Wait, you're collecting that on my child? I had no idea. I just was told that there was a story on NPR this morning about attendance information and the power of using that information to help kids stay in class. Really powerful, but also raising a lot of questions about, wait, why are you collecting that information? And we need to make the case of answering that, being able to answer that question clearly and telling people why we're using something, why we're collecting it, and why it's good for kids. And that's the piece that we have not done a great job doing, is reinforcing why. But these are the things. In your neighborhoods, in your states, I'm sure these are the questions you're getting. What's being collected? Who gets to see it? How is it being protected? How could this be used to hurt my child? Is it going to be sold? These are legitimate questions that we need to unpack and we need to make sure that we're listening to and that we're responding to. And why are we here? What are the challenges that we're facing? And really, this is what we're hoping the panel, the conversation will talk about, is when we look at why we're having this conversation today, it's fourfold. You know, we just haven't done a really great job to date communicating with parents about those issues of why we're collecting this information. And there are a lot of questions about it. Second of all, our information and our data needs, just the explosion of what we're seeing happening in terms of data and technology and education has changed so much, and our policies and practices truly have not been keeping up with the changing amount of information that we have right now. And I'll get to that in a second. Third of all, we're just not really good at talking about some things that have jargon in them, about the cloud. I'd argue that 80% of parents really don't know what the cloud is, and it sounds really, really scary to them because they think that that means everybody has access to everything and it's all up there. And last of all, I think this is just an issue that we're talking about in every sector of our lives, and Charlie just teed that up beautifully about the tensions that we have about information and how we use it, and we control it, and at the same time feel comfortable with it. So where are we in this country? So real briefly as I end up here, we had a lot of conversation in the past year about these concerns and about the power of data and how do we balance these issues. And just to give you a benchmark of what happened, 2 legislative sessions ago, there was absolutely one piece of legislation that dealt with data privacy and security. We talked about this last year at the session. It was Oklahoma. When I compare that map to this past year, where we had 110 pieces of legislation discussed in 36 states, and we'll see, and take a look and see if your state's up there, although you probably know that. And what we know is that we had 28 of those bills signed into law, and this chart gives you a sense of the type of what we saw. A lot of prohibitions on biometric data, a lot of clarifying of what data is being done, national public audits and statements about what's being collected, and a lot of conversations about governance structures and how we deal with this in a constructive way. I want to draw your attention to a paper that's in the back that really summarizes what happened this last legislative session and the information on that. We can talk more about that in questions and answers. But what I want to leave you with, and to answer Charlie's question of what are we doing, why does this matter, and what can we do about it, it really matters that we not just say, yep, this is an issue, we got to deal with it somehow, but we think that there's actually 4 things that every single person in this room can play a role in doing right now to start building this trust and to create an environment of trust and to truly change this culture of using data effectively and making sure that people have the desire not just to use it because they see value in it, but also that they feel that it's safe to use it. And those 4 things are, first of all, we all need to do a better job of communicating the value of this information, why this matters to moms and dads and teachers and students about we need to use this information in the service of students. Second of all, we need to do a much better job of establishing data governance. Many states created chief privacy officers this year. I'm happy to go into more detail about other pieces, but we need to build trust by building clearer roles and responsibilities for who gets to handle this information, how is it shared, how is it controlled, when is it destroyed, what is in the record. These conversations need to be transparent, and people need to understand how this works and who's in charge and where the buck stops. Third of all, we have to do everything possible to continually review our current policies and practices in security and privacy in this country. And we need to make sure that every year we're updating them and making sure that they represent best practices from every sector, not just in education. And fourth of all, we have absolutely got to build the capacity across our sector, especially with our teachers, to help them to understand that they play a frontline role in making sure that we keep this data secure. So that's a quick overview of not only why we're having this conversation, but kind of what's going on in your communities, and I look forward to hearing more about what you all have been doing in your own states to change this conversation. Thanks.
Great. And next we're going to hear from Tennessee, from Senator Dolores Gresham, who is in her 2nd term as senator after 3 terms in the Tennessee House of Representatives, and is actually chairman of the Tennessee Senate Education Committee. She's also a cattle farmer and a former Marine lieutenant colonel. So, Senator Gresham was here last year, went back to Tennessee. I noticed that Tennessee was one of those lit up states in Aimee's chart. So what did you go back and introduce in Tennessee this past year?
Thank you, Mr. Let's see, is this working?
It should be. It's lit. Oh, try that.
All right, there we go. Thank you. Well, thank you for your introduction, sir. I just, before I get started, I want to thank the staff of Excel in Ed. Every time I come to one of these events, I always return home encouraged, excited, and eager to enter the arena again. And so I thank you. I thank you very much. And each year we bring a contingent from Tennessee, and we have some folks here today. And we've got some folks from the Education Committee in the House, Representative Brooks, and Senator Gardenhire, who is one of my stellar members of my committee, is here too. So he may get me later about the stellar things. But anyway, so what happened was I was here last year in Boston anyway. And let me set the stage. I came to the event with a number of things ringing in my ears. And those were things like NSA, Benghazi, IRS, all those Target, all those kinds of things were ringing in my ear because at home, people were really very, very fearful for the privacy of their own personal data and then certainly of their children in the schools. And that was one part of the sound in my head as I came to the event last year. So even though my job today is to tell Tennessee's story is a very personal one for me because the other voices were from the constituency of mine. I have 8 counties in southwest rural Tennessee. And all the town halls, meetings I went to, all the groups that I spoke with, people who came to my office, again, were showing that fear that we've talked about twice already today. Mm-hmm. And, but there was nonetheless a consensus because not only did we have these voices about NSA and the IRS and all that kind of thing going on, we also had the myths of Common Core that were being told everywhere. And so all that was in my constituency's frontal lobes when they talked to me. But nonetheless, wherever I went and however number of people I talked to, there was a consensus among everyone. And the consensus was around 5 points. And the 5 points was, for example, Common Core, high standards. High standards, everyone was for high standards. Second point was they resented any federal intrusion into our education system in Tennessee, and by no means was anyone interested in a nationalized education system. One of the things, again, this fear came up, everybody was against any individual student data mining, and everybody was against any individual student biometric data mining. That was probably the biggest fear. There was also a great fear about, expressed about what was in our textbooks, but that's a whole different other story, and that may be next year. But in any case, there was this consensus about on those 5 points. And so I came to the event in Boston with all that ringing in my ear and went to the session on protecting student data. And the superintendent of instruction, I believe, was the presenter. And so the Senate committee's research analyst was there with me at that session, and he's here today, Michael Marin. And as we listened to the presentation, and you were there, Aimee, yes, and as we listened to the presentation, I looked over at Michael and I said, "Get that bill. We need that." And so in the coming months, we had long discussions with Oklahoma. We talked to Ed and Excel and Ed folks. We talked to some folks at ECS about what was happening in other states. And so we came up with a bill that would respond to the people's fears and protect student data. I thought I might go just through a couple of the highlights of the bill. And it's now Public Chapter 905. It's on the website of the Tennessee General Assembly. But what we required in the bill was that the State Board of Education would publish a list of all data elements that were collected along with the purpose and the reason for them. And then it would restrict access to student data to only authorized staff and contractors of the Department of Ed who required access. LEA administrators, other state agencies that were permitted by law, and parties conducting research that were authorized to do so, and officials conducting interagency audits were allowed. It instructed the department to use only aggregate data, and that would be found in public reports, or public records requests. And it instructed the Commissioner of Education to develop criteria for the approval of any research requests. And then all data that is maintained must be confidential, and all research requests had to use aggregate data. There are a number of points of the bill, but I think one of the most important parts is that it required that a data security plan be developed that included guidance for access to teacher and student data, security plans and audits, and retention and disposal policies. So we were trying to cover the territory on this. I think probably one of the central portions of the bill that I think was so important was that it put parents in the center of the data access issue, in that they would have control over that data to some degree. So it gave parents the right to review the data collected on their students and instructed the department to develop a model policy for allowing parents access to their student data. It required a written consent. So when you want to get parents involved in doing something for their kids at the school, especially in this area, what it required was written consent before any biometric data could be collected. It required a written consent before a survey could be given measuring attitudes, perceptions toward drugs, alcohol, or sex, because those were the kinds of surveys that were going on in our schools at the time, and I cannot tell you how many times that I received emails or phone calls objecting to this kind of dynamic. And it forbids the state from administering an assessment or applying for a grant that would violate any of the written consent requirements for collection of any biometric data or survey data. One of the asides I might add is that it forbids LEAs from collecting information on political affiliation, voting history, and firearms ownership. So the legislature then passed the bill, and I think that they were all on board with this bill because they saw that it protected Tennessee's families. And pretty much that's Tennessee's story, and I'm sticking with it. Thank you.
Okay. So our third panelist is the Chief Privacy Officer of Microsoft Corporation. He is involved in the privacy, or leads the privacy policy creation and implementation throughout Microsoft, and deals with their external stakeholders, which included being on the Aspen Taskforce on Learning and the Internet. And he really was a leading light in terms of helping us think through some of the privacy issues dealing with student data. And Brendon, what was your thinking there?
Well, first of all, thank you for the opportunity to be here and address this audience and share my perspectives. I do feel like I'm wearing a number of hats here today. As a representative of a company which does provide devices and online services, including into the education space. Certainly as a privacy professional, where my day and the many other folks around that company and across industry in my role really focused on how can we ensure that privacy protections are upheld in everything we do. Also as a parent, and I think I brought that to the table too. My two children are beginning their school day in Washington State at this very moment. But I think the thinking very much aligns with what we've already heard so far. It's that we need to find the right way to unlock the value of data, but does so in a way which is also preservative of societal's value for privacy. And striking that right balance, I think, is the core tension in this system. And doing that in a positive way. It was referred to a couple of times, but the fear-based approach of locking everything down, unfortunately, will, we believe, not lead us to the outcomes that we want. In this case, it's the that the learning objectives are achieved and that we continue to advance. So that was sort of a lot of the framing for it, and coming from the experience of, I guess, an organization which operates in virtually every country in the world and having to comply with a varying range of privacy, data protection laws, and customer expectations, which vary widely across different cultures and from product to product. So that's some of the perspective I think I brought to it. And what emerged in the discussions was, because we were taking this more positive approach, it's like, what's going to enable people to feel confident that student data can be used in a way to advance the learning objectives, but in a way that's not going to erode their personal privacy. And we evolved to the concept of a trust framework, and what are the elements of a framework that need to be in place to build trust. And I think if we, perhaps if we pull up the principles that are referenced in the report that you can read, I'll just make a few more comments about some of these. The first one I'll talk about is data stewardship. I think there's two core elements to that, at least. The first is, and this is really for those that are involved, whether it's the technology provider or the schools, whoever's really has control and access to student data, that they need to be good stewards of that data. And what does that mean? It means at least two things. One is data security. First of all, that is fundamental, a building block of trust. If you don't have appropriate investments and protections around the access and to prevent unauthorized access to the data, then all bets are off. So that's a foundational thing. And another aspect of that, I think, is appropriate use. And we know that a lot of the discussion has been what's happening with this data. I mean, that's where a lot of the fear and very valid, I think, concerns and fears have come from, is really not knowing what it is that this information is being used for, or what it might be used for in the future, and what the potential impacts will be. So being very clear that this data is to be used in a very focused way on advancing education and continually improving these services that are used to support education, and to not be used for other means. For example, we believe it should not be used for targeted advertising. Students are not products, and therefore they should not be treated as such. So that's some of the thinking and discussions we had around the data stewardship piece. Transparency, of course, is crucial. I think there's the saying that sunlight is the best disinfectant. I think that's very true here in this situation, and it certainly applies here. And as Aimee outlined earlier as well, what does that mean in the context of data? It's being very transparent about what's being collected, how it's being used, who it's being shared with, how it's being protected, and all of those things, so that people can feel a degree of confidence, or at least be armed with the information for them to ask the right questions and make informed decisions and choices, which leads to the principle of participation. There was very much a belief that, armed with this knowledge that comes through the transparency, that schools, parents, regulators, students themselves should be able to question and should actively participate in questioning and making, helping make sure that important decisions are made. For example, asking what are the restrictions on how student data might be collected and used. Perhaps asking if there's a contract established that actually protects those rights, and that the school would have recourse if that contract was broken. Things like that I think will be really helpful in building trust around this. And then I'll just say a point about accountability as well. Obviously all of the actors in this space need to be accountable to the core principles, establish all the right policies and procedures. That's what a chief privacy officer does day in and day out. We need to ensure that across industry and across the education sector, that becomes the norm, that everybody does put the right policies and procedures in place. Codes of conduct can play a good role. And an example of that recently, which emerged, it's called the School Service Providers Pledge to Safeguard Student Privacy. It was jointly released by the Future of Privacy Forum and the Software and Information Industry Association. And this pledge is built around a dozen commitments, very similar to the ones we've talked about on this panel and that are on this slide. And we think things like that are very helpful in this debate. Microsoft was one of the initial companies that signed on to that when it launched last month. I do understand that there are now over 50 companies have signed on to that. So you should take that as a really strong indication that much of industry is also aligned around the need to build trust and the use of technology in education. So I think that's sort of a summary of how those principles are manifesting themselves today.
Great. So let's just go back, and you're a private vendor, a private company vendor, who's dealing with a school system. Are there additional safeguards, or how do you approach it? I guess Microsoft is a vendor, but you're one of the, I'll just say, better actors in this field. But what are some advice you might have to individual vendors, whether they're for-profit or nonprofit, in dealing with schools? Do you have any advice?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think there's a very good alignment, and there's actually a very good market incentive for trust as well. So we've had a very long-held belief that a recognition that people will not use technology they do not trust, and trust is very much being the foundation of not only our privacy program, but how we approach security and many other things. And it's not just the industry that we're talking about here today. It's across all industry are actually grappling with this same thing. Every industry has a real profound opportunity today to leverage data to drive innovation, no matter what industry you're in. And yet they, particularly if it's relating to information that relates to individuals, there's a real need to balance that out. There's a quote our CEO made recently, actually. I jotted it down here because it just shows how we've, as a technology vendor, have got this so embedded in our strategy. When he launched our new strategy, he said, "We will strike the right balance between using data to create intelligent, personal experiences while maintaining security and privacy." So, that's that alignment in action. This was a CEO, unprompted by me, saying that this is core to how we'll be successful in the future, how we'll enable society to get all the benefits of technology, but do so in a way that's protective of privacy. So I think that's the key point here, is that the actual objectives align and incentives align. And I think, yes, some companies may be more enlightened to that fact than others, but I think that's a part of our duty of all of us to propagate that.
So, Senator, you've talked about the role of parents. Is there a role the parents should be playing beyond the protections of the legislation, that they can be playing a role in the individual schools and in their day-to-day lives in this scheme?
Well, testing.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we would certainly hope that would continue to increase. The fact that that our education system does now require that they give written consent for certain things, that will awaken the interest for other participation. But certainly certainly our goal is to build that trust so that they will continue to participate. Yeah. Okay.
So, Aimee, you've watched the legislation throughout the states. Are there some particular provisions that you think are that some of the states are using that are, let's just say, enlightened, and obviously Tennessee, we've heard theirs, but or on the other side, some that are particularly harmful that you see to the promotion of the use, the good and safe use of data?
So yes, so we think that the states that spent the time to really create governance structures and to build that transparency that the senator talked about are really the ones that are going to go the furthest of creating trust, but not only that, but being more efficient, of not trying to legislate for today's issues, Because if we know nothing else, we know that the issues that we're facing today around data and technology are going to be completely different than the specific issues that we're going to be facing in 10 minutes, in 6 months and 6 years. And so oftentimes what we saw is that, that where we saw bills and legislation that very much dealt with the trust building pieces. Let me just be really explicit about what we just all set up here. One, that mandated an audit of every year that we're going to publish on our state website exactly what data is being collected, who has access to it, and why this helps kids. That goes a long way to taking some of the boogeyman out of the data piece when people have that information. Because all of a sudden it's, oh, I understand why you collect that and that means something. The second thing that states did that we thought was really constructive is that they set up governance structures that were clear and open, and people realized that there was someone in charge. And I think this is an interesting point here, because a really important message for us to get across in this conversation is everyone has a role to play in safeguarding data. Everyone, parents, students themselves, teachers, the media, everybody has a role to play. But also, when everybody's responsible for something, sometimes no one's responsible. And we think that's one of the other great things that happened across the country is that states were very explicit about setting up data governance, setting up chief privacy officers, setting up procedures that were going to be dealing with the issues, not just that were being dealt with in states today, but that also provided a structure for those conversations to happen in the future. So lots and lots of good things. Some of the concerns that we had were some of the laws that took the prohibitive approach. I mean, lots of those prohibitions were put in place because parents are just upset, and we had to listen to that. And legislators had to say, we hear you. We hear that some of this is just creepy sounding, and parents don't like creepiness. And that's, you can't legislate non-creepiness, but you can take some efforts. And I think that's also where we also saw some things maybe go that I think we're going to see a lot of legislation this upcoming term that will be going back and correcting some of that. And I'll just give a very quick example on that. On some of the biometric pieces, what people were scared about were things about eye scans, retinal eye scans, which we can tell you we have not found a single place in the country that is doing that with students. And yet that was the fear, right? Nobody wants their kids to have retina scans to say, am I happy when I'm taking a math test? I don't want that. But that was what people were legislating against, and yet what's happened is that sometimes we said no biometric information, and lots of folks are all of a sudden figuring out all the good things that are being done to help kids learn with biometric. We're hearing some interesting stories about class ring sizes and graduation robes, that those measurements can't be taken in schools anymore. I'm not sure if that's farce or real, but we are hearing some things about language labs, recording of the voice, that's a biometric piece. And think about that. If you can't record your child talking about Spanish in a lab, if that's what a waste not to use that innovation and that technology to help your kid get their accent right in 3rd grade. So that's just one simple example, and I think we're going to have a lot of conversation about how do we find that balance of making sure that people are comfortable with how we're using it and that there are restrictions, but not to the point where we are stifling innovation and we're not taking advantage of this incredible tool that we now have of data and technology to help each one of our children succeed.
Senator?
Thank you. I just wanted to comment on your statement there that we do in Tennessee's bill have an anti-creepiness bill, portion of the bill, but more so it goes to accountability. And I'll just quote here. It requires that the governor and the General Assembly be notified within 60 days of the following: that a new data field is added to the student data system, that any changes are made to existing data collected, any exemptions granted for release of student data by the State Board of Education, accompanied by an explanation, and then the results of compliance or security audits, so that the General Assembly is keeping tabs on this, and parents who might read the bill or at least be told about what has been done in their Tennessee legislature is assured that, as you say, Aimee, someone is in charge, whether it's a CFO or the legislators, because indeed we are held accountable.
So we're going to call for questions from the audience. There are mics on either side, so please come forward. While we're waiting for that, and when you do come forward, you can also make a comment. It doesn't have to be a question. It could be a comment. Just say who you are, identify yourself. But before we do that, I just have one more question to the panel. I just wanted to start getting people thinking about the questions. And that is the federal legislation. FERPA, I can't say what FERPA stands for. Federal Educational
Family.
Family. Okay. So that's
Magic,
why I
it's
shouldn't
magic.
have even started. Anyway, anybody want to speak to FERPA and the interest in possibly amending FERPA? Aimee?
Sure. So we are following this a lot, and I think just like all of you, hard state policymakers have heard an earful from your constituents about concerns. Members of Congress are also hearing a lot from their constituents. And so we think it is very, very likely that there will be legislation introduced. There's already been discussion drafts by senators introduced, by Senators Wyden and Markey. And we also are hearing that there's going to be some language shared on the House side as well. And I think that it's because they have to be responsive to what their citizens are also telling them about their fears of how things are happening. So happy to talk more in detail about that, what we're thinking. But I think lots and lots of conversations will be happening, I think, at every level of government, and it should be. And that's a good conversation to have, because part of building trust is making sure that people's voices are heard in this process. And that goes a long way for people to feel like people are listening and we're talking about this. And this is what makes this country great, is that we don't put things under the rug, we talk about it. So.
Brendon, are you dealing with the FERPA
Well,
amendments?
I think I just make the general comment that I think the opportunity, legislation, enforcement, that sort of things do also play an important role in a trust framework. And so whether it's at the federal or the state level, I think it's important to embrace these core principles we've been talking about, whether it's updating a new law or introducing a new one. And actually the student privacy pledge I mentioned earlier might be a good starting point to kind of do that cross-checking of, you know, where are the mature players in industry, you know, committing to building trust, and could those principles at least be considered in these proposals?
And sorry,
Good.
Senators Hatch and Markey, sorry, I was thinking about Wyden and something else, excuse me.
Go ahead. And please identify yourself first.
Sure. My name is Chola Gupta, and I'm with the Chicago Public Education Fund. We fund a lot of personalized learning and blended learning innovations in Chicago schools. And one of the roadblocks we're facing is that every EdTech vendor has a new and a different way of wanting to collect data, a new format, a new package. And for administrators, it just becomes burdensome to track who's got what data and then to sort of regulate and enforce it. So my question is there any movement among the EdTech vendors and providers to standardize the way data is collected, so that for school districts it becomes easier to take it in just one package and only sort of share back information with vendors that is useful and is needed?
Great question. Brendon, do you?
Yeah, I guess just again a general comment. I think it's a fantastic question, and I hear that a lot too. And just the fragmentation makes it more challenging, because you've got to have this. You know, the transparency gets, you know, multiplied by how many vendors there are, and it's confusing. So I think in some ways that's where standardization might help in a couple of different ways. You know, like aligning around core principles, for example, you know, at least communicating in the same way, having a common taxonomy so that these things mean the same thing across vendors is a part of the help. But also, you know, I think on a portability standpoint, and you know, solutions that might help to aggregate and provide, you know, dashboards and controls and things, whether it's for schools or for parents, are also a key part of it. I don't think it's solved, but I think it's a really good question and a real challenge to the industry to do that.
Okay. Anyone else? No.
Thank you.
Let's move on.
Paul Lundeen. I'm currently on the State Board of Education in Colorado, moving over to the legislature. A parent approached me recently and had a question around the intersection of HIPAA and FERPA in a situation where there were health issues with the child and also obviously educational issues. Do you have feedback and comments in the meshing of those data gathering components and protections? And then the second question is, it's my perspective that data fields have become policy. And so that's a large part of the definition of this conversation, is how we're defining the data fields becomes a matter of public policy conversation. And the question I have for you with regard to that are, what are the most controversial data fields that are currently being discussed?
Okay.
Wow, a lot. Great. So first of all, congratulations, because Colorado, I think, has one of the most constructive and great laws that we hold up as an example of really doing a great job with the transparency and the governance. So congratulations. The first question about FERPA HIPAA, on our website, everything in the back is available, and everything's on our website area. And there's actually a whole piece, kind of a policymaker's guide in English, to all of the different pieces of federal legislation around privacy, including how HIPAA and FERPA relate. I'm not a lawyer, don't play one on TV. But my understanding, and any of the lawyers in the room correct me, is that when there are health issues and involves in schools with kids, FERPA is what trumps and becomes what happens. So the health information gets protected under FERPA. And so there are all kinds of things. Someone yell if I'm saying that wrong. But there's a whole section on our website, and I'm happy to direct you to it, that gives some good language on that and then sends you to other places to go to. And on the third piece about data is policy, yes, what you measure is what you value. And I think this is the conversation that we need to have, that there's a lot of information data being collected right now in this country that we probably don't need anymore. And that's also one of the really great benefits out of these audits and these inventories that need to be done in many of the states right now. Because what we're gonna find out is that we're collecting stuff, and this happens at the federal level and at the state level. We are collecting things that we have no idea why we're collecting it anymore. And so I personally hope that one of the great things that comes out of this is that we see a huge reduction, not huge, but a reduction in some of the data that we are collecting, because we figure out no one's using it. And instead, we have this conversation of what are those priority questions that we really care about, and how do we make sure that we're collecting that information, because it does matter. And every data collection we do has a burden in some way and has a risk at some point, and what we need to do is to limit that to what we actually need. And your last question, because boy, you had a loaded questions, is what's the most controversial? I'll go back to the NPR story today that Mike told me about. You know, attendance data, you think we collect attendance data all the time in this country, and yet the gist of the story that I haven't heard yet is it was kind of creepy of now, because of the power of predictive analytics, which sounds scary, but it's nothing more than we actually see patterns in things. It's what we're using in community policing, it's what we're using in retail, it's human behaviors where we do things. And so I think the fear is, well, wait a second, you're now going to be able to tell my kid when they're going to be absent and tell me when they're going to be, and there's that concern of government having access to that information. And yet, this is the conversation we need to have of what we know is that kids who aren't in school are not able to learn. And if this is about how do we help kids get to school and can we take actions to make sure we're there, is that worth using this information to make sure we're getting kids to school? And I think this is a conversation that you all, as policymakers, need to guide your citizenry around, because that's a value judgment. Are we willing to use that information if it goes for good, and how do we make sure it's protected and it's not used inappropriately? And that's why these are really, really hard, nuanced conversations, and they're really important to have with the American people.
Anybody else?
Hi, my name's Caleb Elison, and I'm with School Improvement Network. To answer the standards question, we are a vendor of many states, and there's a group called IMS Global who is designing standards for APIs that are exchanged between company to company. Those APIs are called LTI, which is Learner Technology Interoperability. So there is a lot of education technology companies, probably more than 50 to 60 already, that are a member of IMS Global, that are all working together to create a standard tool or APIs to exchange with one another to make it easier.
Great information. And I would just point out one of our recommendations in the Aspen Taskforce was interoperability, which is a tough problem and it's hard to explain, generally, but the more we have it and the more that private entities are coming together to adopt standards, the better.
Yes. To follow on, my name is Joe Fertoni. I'm the CEO of an EdTech company. We look at trying to improve student performance through family engagement, which obviously gets into a lot of touch points, the type of data that's collected, who owns the data, et cetera. And I'd have to tell you that as a CEO, responsible CEO, I think I know FERPA better than most legislatures, most school districts, and that's an embarrassment, just to start with. Back to the question that really made me stand up here was the question as to what data should be, is there a set way we should be doing it? You're going to limit creativity. And as you can tell by my age, I'm not born yesterday, I'm aware of responsibility of what we need to do. But a lot of the ed tech creators, all the new ideas that everything is coming from, are coming from a lot of younger people who don't know what data privacy is. They live in the Facebook world, et cetera. And I think that if there's something that I could tell legislators to do, or anyone else to do, is just instead of saying, this is the way you should be doing it, which is wrong, you should say guidelines, these are the ways you need to show that you comply to our methodology of what that needs to be. And that's going to be on an individual state district level, because that's really, really important. The other part is you had mentioned about the different types of data that's collected, and then how it could be used, just as you had mentioned about attendance. It could be used really good, as you were talking about, and it could also be extrapolated to be something really bad. So there needs to be an idea of some control of the types of rules that are used to analyze the data as well, because that becomes very, very important, because good data can become very bad data very, very quickly, and then it's like shooting yourself in the foot. So it was just a comment. Thank you.
Good. That's great. User-centric identity is one area where technology is, at least there's an attempt to have technology be one of the solutions instead of just having legislation. Brendon, are you, have you looked at and thought about the issue of technology solutions themselves as opposed to kind of the legislation and
Yeah, I think in general, a lot of these questions and concerns are coming up based on technology advancements. And so on one hand, you could say that technology is causing the problems if information is misused. So there is a growing field and a lot of thinking around how can we actually put technology to good use to help solve the problem and to help build trust, and that's happening in a number of areas. Part of it's just what can we put in the hands of individuals to put them in more control over how their information is collected and used, and there's all sorts of capabilities and technologies across the sector being put into that. How can we talked, data governance was mentioned earlier, data stewardship, another term, but how do you, once you've got it and we know what the rules are, how can we just ensure that day in and day out that those rules are honored? And so having systems built in a way that the rules associated with the data sort of travel with the data, and the systems that interact with it are clear on what the restrictions of use will be. There's another whole field, I think, of where technology providers are looking to provide value to actually just ensure that everybody who's accountable to these rules, wants to live up to these rules, can do so easily.
It brings up something that John Bailey from the foundation brought up in our deliberations, which was data backpacks and being able to, the portability of data. So, you want certain restrictions, but you also want to be able to move that data along with the learner. Let's go next.
Hi, I'm Pete Miller. I'm in the Indiana State Senate. I'm going to give a very specific example, but I'm really just trying to highlight a couple broader governance issues. So in Indiana right now, we're debating pre-K, and one of the arguments that advocates use for investing in pre-K is that we'll save costs later on. So 20 years hence, we'll spend less on social services, spend less on incarceration. So that's a very valid question. So 20 years from now, we may want to say, did that investment pay off? But that question now is beyond the Department of Education. You're involving Department of Corrections, we want workforce development, we want to involve the social services, and you can't really measure that in aggregate. Somebody in one of those departments somewhere has to take that individual record and track what happened to that child as they progress. So how is that question answered within the framework of keeping privacy, and how is that governed?
So thanks for giving me the platform to advertise that we have just released yesterday at 12:01 our annual survey on the capacity of states to not just collect information, but also to ensure that it's being used in the service of students. And one of the data points that we report yesterday is that states are making great progress in being able to connect appropriately and limited amounts of necessary information between early learning, K-12, post-secondary, and workforce, and yet only 19 states, and that hasn't grown at all since last year, are able to connect their K-12 systems with their workforce systems. And because there are lots of issues, one of them being Social Security number. That one of the things we saw is that states just outlawed the use of Social Security numbers with K-12, thinking, okay, we'll keep that information out with good reason, and yet that is the greatest, most reliable link for workforce information. And so we'll figure out the technology piece. We have all kinds of smart people and companies and organizations that are thinking about the technology, but it's really building the value proposition among policymakers to understand why some of the most important questions that state policymakers are wrestling with require information that flows from multiple different distinct data sets, and that we can't keep things siloed because we're only going to get limited pictures of what's going on if we're not able to connect that. But the key message is, when we're talking about linking that, it's not linking everything, it's not giving everyone access. Literally, I think in Minnesota, which had one of the first pieces of legislation, I think in 1998, establishing the link between K-12 and post-secondary to get high school feedback reports back, which is so important to give information to high schools about how well prepared were your students and how many went on to higher ed and did they need remediation. Really important information, but they basically said they could answer all the priority questions they wanted to get back to the secondary system by basically, I think it was linking 11 data points, and that there's only 2 people in the entire state, that the keymaster, that can put it together. Nobody else knows the identities, everything's de-identified. And that's part of this conversation we need to have is, what are we trying to do? What's the limited amount of information we need to do it? And then how do we do this in a way that's safe and secure and that we can get the information that you all need as policymakers, we need as citizens, without also having great risk of this information, sensitive information being hurt. So I think there's absolutely a way to do it, and there's a lot of great lessons from states who have done it, like Utah, we just recognized yesterday, is doing a really great job with their data governance and building those systems as well.
Yeah, I think it was a great intervention, and it invoked 2 thoughts for me. The first is, there's this buzzword of big data, and that passes around a lot. And I think that what you're articulating was a scenario where, being able to see patterns across massive sets of data over time, could have some real societal value. And I think that's one of the promises of so-called big data. And it is going to be the challenge of our time, I think, to be able to enable those sorts of insights to improve society, but do it in a privacy protective way. And it sort of brought me back to an extension of my response to the last comment, which is around how can technology solve these things. And I think there's some I see promising research in our company and others, and examples where people are really seeking ways to get insights from data across these silos in a way without actually having to create an identified database, master database, if you like. And there's some examples just in mergers and acquisitions, for example, where a part of the valuation of a company might be, the overlap that you might have on customer databases. And, these entities don't trust each other yet. So, there are techniques using cryptography and other things where you can sort of, using de-identified data sets, do matching and find correlations and get meaningful insights, in this case, to actually help form the valuation of an acquisition without sharing that data across or combining data at all. So I do think that this is a case where technology innovation will come forth to help us get those insights but still protect privacy.
I think the conversation is very challenging for all of society. But for those of us who are here and concerned with the data that is collected on our students, and parents are concerned about the data that's collected on their children, that the data that we collect is used, analyzed for better student outcomes, because that's why we're here, so that we can do the best work we can for children. And the larger issues, we'll have to take care of that, but taking care of and improving student outcomes is what we're here for.
Okay, next.
Angelica Schroeder, State Board of Education from Colorado. While we as board members heard a lot from parents and our legislators heard a lot from parents, the data breaches occur probably not even at the school district level, but at the school level and at the classroom level. That's where we have folks who are uninitiated in knowing when they are taking risks, when they get free programs, et cetera. And my understanding is there still are no consequences when we have these data breaches that occur at school classroom levels. Can you speak to that? Is there any new legislation that kind of tightens that particular concern? Because it's one of the strongest ones I've heard about.
Accountability.
Absolutely, accountability is foremost in our minds always. But I haven't yet heard information about that kind of breach in our school systems. Not that they don't occur, but it hasn't come to the level yet where we're thinking about some kind of legislation. But that's a really, really good point, and it's like I said before at the very beginning, every time I come to these events, I'm going to pick up a piece of information that I need to take home, and so I thank you for your question.
So let me give you an example. A teacher is offered some free software, and they put in student information, and then it turns out
exactly.
They're on a for sale list, et cetera.
Just a couple of data points. I think a couple of states, and I can't find it on my notes, but it's in here, if you want to pick it up, did put in some consequences, and I think that will be more of a conversation and very clear. But I think in a positive way, though, we also had 47 bills that dealt with data breaches and talked about this, and 13 were written into law talking about we need processes for dealing with this. There needs to be transparency. People need to be alerted so that also people are learning from this, and we're raising the awareness so that of everybody. But I think what I respond to your question on and what it speaks to so incredibly well is the need to make sure that we're building the ability and the capacity of our teachers to understand that they are on the front line of this. Right. And that the decisions that they're making, especially with just the explosion of incredibly powerful, wonderful new tools in their classrooms that they're excited to use, of the responsibility that comes with using that well. DQC put out a paper last February with many organizations on data literacy. And for the first time ever, the field has created a definition of what it means to be a data literate educator. And part of being a data literate educator means that you understand your role and responsibility to treat that data ethically, morally, and to protect it. And we need to do a lot more in this country in licensure, certification, in our training, in our service to make sure that every teacher in this country understands their role and responsibility to protect their kids' data. And we all need to do that. So lots of ideas we have and I'm happy to talk about, but we've got to raise awareness of that.
So, and just my little 2 cents is that, yes, we need to create this sense of responsibility and trust on the part of the teacher, but we don't want to have them so fearful that they are not willing to do anything. So they've got to understand, be intelligent adults in dealing with this. So that's good. Yes, next.
Hi, Scott McQuagan from SAS Institute. This is actually what my question is in regards to is how do we help teachers communicate with parents more effectively, especially around doing parent notification if they're adopting a new piece of ed tech. How do we ensure that parents understand what that piece of ed tech is collecting? A lot of those companies are going to follow along with the Children Online Privacy Protection Act and get that parent notification for them. But that's often a difficult process to get that parent's permission for the student to use that software. So I'm just wondering if any of you have encountered great solutions on how we're helping teachers communicate with parents and get that parent permission. Thank you.
Well, perhaps I'll start. I think it's an important role that the EdTech community needs to play. It goes back to the transparency principle in a way. It's not just be transparent in really extensive detail. You need that because there are people who are going to vet you from is this the right entity to go with. You've also got to be able to help explain it in very clear terms. And having been focused on privacy for 15 years now, at the core of enabling privacy and transparency is the notice and choice and privacy statements and the like. And I can tell you it's very challenging to do that. It's one of the most challenging things to do, particularly as things are getting more and more complex and there's more to explain. And so we've got to balance that out with a degree of simplicity and being able to communicate very clearly what the implications are of the data, in the uses. And so I think it's everything from building it into user interface of the technology itself through to being fully transparent in the negotiations and and marketing materials and really partnering with the providers, the schools, to help them fully understand it and put it in terms they think will resonate best for the parents and for the students. So it's going to need to be a partnership.
I'll just add, I think we had a phenomenal example yesterday at lunch. Joel Klein giving those examples about what happens and literally describing, we're not just personalizing learning, but getting very specific about creating the list of vocabulary words and how it was working. Parents don't know what we're talking about. I don't know what we're talking about sometimes when we talk about using technology to personalize learning. But we have got to do a better job of breaking it down and helping parents understand why this transforms everything and is going to help their kids. And we haven't been speaking in English, to go back to my thing. We have not been talking to parents and helping them understand. We've just done a huge amount of work with parents. We just did 8 focus groups around the country on parents. And what we learned is parents want this. They want the technology. They want the data. They want anything that will help their children, but they don't understand what we're trying to talk about and what we're talking about here. And so I think a huge part of this is, and Brendon said this, people won't use information that they don't find value in and they don't understand why or how it's going to help their kids or help them, and they will not use information that they don't trust. Those are our 2 things that if we believe in the power of data and the power of technology to help every kid in this country reach their goals, those are the 2 things that we have got to walk out of this door and change the conversation about.
And it comes with the environment in a given school, just like Andy was talking about this morning. Now, there's a school where apparently the environment is such that people have a trust in what's going on with their leadership. And it takes disciplined, principled leadership to get that across. So all this happens within the context of really true visionary educational leadership. And so that's really the critical part.
Okay, last question, and then after that, I'm also going to ask each panelist to leave us with one final thought. Yes.
Sure. Sam Rauschenberg. I'm in Georgia with the Governor's Office of Student Achievement. We house the P20 data system, longitudinal data system. One of the things that hasn't been talked about as much is the use of de-identified data for independent researchers to do all kinds of research, as has been done, particularly in Florida and North Carolina and other states. And a lot of these bills have looked at just sharing aggregate data and outlawing the sharing of de-identified data. And so I think I'd love to hear some more clarity on kind of the implication of those bills on that kind of research and where that line is, because obviously de-identified data is still student level data. So
yeah. How about Brendon?
Well, I think de-identification is a tool in the toolbox in mitigating privacy risk, and there are going to be cases where that will be really helpful. It's sort of a wide spectrum from fully identified through to completely anonymous and aggregate, and many points in between. And I think the role of all of us who have responsibility over the collection and use of data need to determine where on that spectrum we need to be and try and push it down as much as we can. Do we need it fully identified? Could we get the outcomes we're looking for with using de-identified data? It's not an absolute, as you were pointing out, and we should never sell it as such, but we should sell it as mitigating the risk. And the way it helps, for example, is if someone gets unauthorized access, a hacker or something, to a de-identified database, and they don't have the key which compares it to the real student, then you have reduced the risk of that data if it falls into the wrong hands. So it does form a valuable purpose. But I think it takes a disciplined approach to kind of do a privacy impact assessment, if you like, across a new data collection or new data use, and see what mitigations you can put in place. De-identification may or may not help based on the outcome you're trying to achieve, or it may be other things that you need to put in place, really limiting the access or whatever it is to mitigate the risk.
So some technologists tell me that you can always re-identify at some point. You can kind of pull together data. Do you believe that you can truly de-identify and effectively de-identify?
Well, I think there's a difference between de-identifying and claiming that it's anonymous, right? And I think that that's why I was being careful in saying it, is it's not an absolute, but it is moving the data set down the risk spectrum. And because we're balancing the opportunity and the positive uses of data, we're going to find ourselves in that place all the time. But yes, you're right. I mean, there are challenges. If people have access to vast amounts of data and correlating databases, and they can look for patterns, and it's been proven in a lot of computer science research and the like that even the most de-identified databases have a degree of identifiability if you have the resources. So we should never oversell this, but we should, I think, position it all in the realm of responsible use and limiting risk so that we can get the outcomes we want to achieve with the least risk.
Okay. So last thoughts as we leave this great panel. Brendon, why don't we start with you? Go in reverse order. You've
Okay.
What would you want to leave people with? What's the takeaway from this session?
I might go for two. One would be, we talk about data, we focus on data, but we should just remember that it's not about, when it's not data we're protecting, it's people we're protecting, and in this case it's children. So it is very real. But also, I think it's just getting that balance, striking the right balance is what we all need to walk out here, I think, and try and achieve. Is ensure that we can achieve the outcomes we want, that we want for our children, our students, in a way that's also protective of the societal value of privacy.
These are challenging days. We have all kinds of sources for different kinds of data, but whatever it is that we collect, that we, again, use it for the best outcomes we can for children, because the data just really helps us understand what's happening, and what's happening not only in our schools, but with individual children. And so as long as we kind of keep that in our main perspective, I think we'll be fine.
Okay.
I'll just put this conversation in the larger context of this incredible conference. I mean, how can we listen to what we heard this morning in that data and not say, we have to do something different, it's not working?
Right.
And how you cannot hear our TED conversation yesterday and not be totally inspired by, we can do this, it's already starting to happen, and we have to do this differently, and the future's not next decade, it's tomorrow. And we have to change how we use information and how we use technology, because our kids deserve it and our country needs to demand it. And that's what I encourage us all to walk away from this conversation with. This is exciting, this is positive, this is a way to help our kids, and that the conversation about data and about safeguarding data needs to all happen not in a vacuum, and that's when we have, I think, things happen that limit the power of information and technology, is when these conversations happen in a vacuum and not in that broader context of, this is an exciting, good thing that we're talking about, and yes, we have to make sure we talk about safeguarding it, but this has to be framed as, this is good. And that actually, I'll end with that. That to me, and I should have said this earlier, is probably the best thing that happened in the state laws. So many states started their pieces of legislation with, we believe in the power of data to reach our goals in this state for every kid. That matters to start the privacy conversation with that statement of, we believe in data. So go forth in good, positive thinking about the power of data and the need to listen to concerns about it.
Well, hopefully our conversation moved from this discussion of fear to a discussion of trust, and ultimately, I think what we have to remember is it's the student, it's the learner in the center that is what it's all about, and we want to help it. We want them to be we don't want to send them to a back alley, but we want them to be in a great environment that is going to have them be successful in the future. So thank you for a great panel. Thank you.